He was just supposed to be another model, one of many. But that night, as the rain tapped against the studio windows and the canvas sat unfinished, something changed. And I realized I didn't want him to leave. The dim golden light from the studio's hanging lamp spilled across the wooden floor, casting long, soft shadows that danced around scattered canvases and abandoned brushes. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and charcoal dust, layered with something warmer, perhaps the trace of candle wax or time itself. Julian stood at his easel, quietly focused, the back of his hand marked with smudges of ochre and gray. His eyes flicked from the canvas to the man sitting across the room. Theo sat with stillness only few could master. Draped in a dark robe, he occupied the vintage armchair Julian had placed beneath the tall window. His pose was relaxed yet composed, almost as if he had grown into the role over time, as though the chair remembered him each time he returned. The outside world beyond the frosted glass had grown darker by the minute, yet neither of them had noticed how late it had become. This was meant to be their final session. The last sitting of a project Julian had once thought would span no more than a few weeks. It had extended into something far longer, slower, more intimate, not in body but in presence. Every painting Julian made of Theo had come out differently, as if the canvas caught new emotions each time. Not one version felt final. Julian dipped his brush into a thin wash of color, paused, and set it back down. His hands felt steady, but his chest did not. The silence between them was never uncomfortable, only deliberate, like both were afraid to puncture it too soon. There was something about Theo's presence that Julian still struggled to define. It wasn't beauty, though Theo was undeniably beautiful in a quiet, weather-worn kind of way. It wasn't only grace or stillness either, but something softer, more difficult to name, a kind of patience that had worn through Julian's usual artistic detachment. Julian remembered the first time Theo had entered the studio. Reserved, observant, polite to a fault. He had come through a friend's recommendation and had seemed almost reluctant to accept the role. But over time, something changed. Julian wasn't sure when it happened, but he knew that at some point, Theo stopped posing and started being. Outside, the rain began to tap lightly against the windows, barely audible beneath the steady hum of the heater in the corner. The room felt insulated from time, like a snow globe in motionless suspension. Julian studied Theo for a long time, not because he needed to finish the painting, but because he was afraid of what finishing it might mean. This final session had loomed for days, maybe weeks. Julian had delayed it twice, claimed the light wasn't right, or that he needed new canvas. He'd told himself it was about the art, but the truth was more fragile. He wasn't ready for it to be over. Theo finally shifted a small motion, his hand adjusting the robe at his shoulder. Julian looked away, suddenly aware of the weight of his own gaze. The brush still rested on the easel shelf, untouched for minutes. The painting in front of him was close to complete, possibly finished, but it didn't feel finished. There was a tension that lingered, soft but insistent, like the silence before a storm. It wasn't awkwardness or discomfort, it was possibility, the kind that rarely appeared, and when it did, it sat just on the edge of being named. Julian moved away from the easel, slowly, careful not to startle the moment into retreat. He busied himself with cleaning brushes, the repetitive movement a weak disguise for the thoughts unraveling in his head. He didn't want Theo to leave. Not yet. Maybe not at all. But saying that would break something. Or worse, reveal it. Theo's eyes followed Julian as he moved. Neither spoke. There had never been much need for words between them. Their connection had been built on glances, gestures, the unspoken cadence of trust that forms between people who let silence stretch without fear. The rain outside grew heavier, softening the edges of the world beyond studio. Inside, warmth gathered in corners, around the fireplace embers, along the edges of canvases leaning against the walls, and between the two men who hadn't yet said what they were thinking. Julian poured a glass of water and brought it over, setting it gently beside Theo. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. Neither pulled away. As Theo looked up, their eyes met, and this time neither looked aside. Something had changed. Neither knew what would come next. But in the stillness of that studio, with rain whispering against the glass and unfinished paint drying on the canvas, one thing had become clear. The session might be over, but the night wasn't. The sound of the rain deepened as the night carried on, blurring softly against the tall windows like distant static. Inside the studio, the world remained suspended, still, enclosed, touched by the amber glow of low-hanging lights and the faint smell of drying oil paints. Julian hadn't said anything after their eyes met. Theo hadn't either. Yet something had undeniably shifted. The silence between them now felt dense, as if laced with waiting. Theo had not made any move to leave. His robe was still loosely tied around his frame, and the chair had become less of a pose and more of a place of rest. Julian busied himself around the studio, pretending to tidy up, though nothing really required attention. He moved a stack of unused canvases to one side, adjusted the position of a potted plant that hadn't bloomed in weeks, refilled the kettle even though they hadn't spoken about tea. The weight of the evening pressed against him, not with urgency, but with awareness. Every moment felt stretched, like a long inhale with no exhale. He kept his back turned more than he needed to. It was easier that way, easier not to confront the questions forming in his mind. But he could still feel Theo's presence behind him, not imposing, just present, solid, warm. Eventually, the kettle whistled. Julian poured 2 cups without asking. One green ceramic mug, worn at the rim, the other plain white. He carried both to the small side table near the easel and set them down. Theo shifted again, his legs folding beneath him as he reached slowly for the drink, nodding in silent thanks. Their fingers didn't touch this time, but they were close, closer than necessary. Julian took the chair opposite. For a while, neither spoke. The air between them was full, not of tension, but of fragile curiosity. The kind that arises when boundaries have blurred, and both people are waiting to see who redraws them first. He glanced at Theo over the rim of his cup. There was something about the way Theo held the mug in both hands, cradling it like a temporary anchor. His expression was unreadable, but peaceful. His eyes scanned the studio as if he was seeing it for the first time. Theo's gaze landed on one of the early sketches Julian had pinned on the wall. It was rough, unfinished, a side profile done in hurried charcoal. Julian followed his eyes and chuckled under his breath. Not because it was funny, but because it was intimate to realize someone else had memorized the space so well. Most people never noticed the sketches. Julian spoke first, not quite sure why. He said something about the weather, pointless, but safe. Theo nodded, gave a half-smile. Then, softly, Julian mentioned how quiet the house had been lately, how he often worked late just to avoid the silence. He didn't mean to admit that, but once the words were out, they stayed between them. Theo didn't respond right away. When he did, it was with a quiet nod and a comment about how silence could sometimes be heavier than sound. It was the kind of thing people said when they meant something else entirely. Julian understood that too well. Their conversation stayed there for a while, light but real. They spoke of books they had read, paintings they admired. Julian told a story about how one of his pieces had been misinterpreted in a gallery once, and Theo listened with that same attentive stillness he carried during every pose. But under the surface, something deeper moved. With every glance, every shift, every shared pause, they drew closer in ways that didn't need words. Julian noticed it in how Theo's knees angled toward him now, how his fingers no longer gripped the mug, but rested gently around it, how his robe had slipped slightly at the collar, revealing just enough skin to remind Julian of his humanness, not as a model, but as a man. Julian wanted to say something, but language felt inadequate. Instead, he reached for a worn sketchbook and handed it across the table. Theo opened it slowly, flipping through pages filled with graphite and pigment, portraits, landscapes, fragments of thought. Most were rough, unfinished. A few were studies of Theo, done from memory, not pose. Julian hadn't planned to show those to anyone. Theo lingered on one page longer than the rest. a soft pencil sketch of him laughing, something that had happened only once and fleetingly during their second session. Julian remembered the sound clearly, but had never tried to recreate it. Until that day, the silence between them changed again, not heavier, but fuller. Gratitude, recognition, maybe something more. Julian leaned back, running a hand through his hair. His chest ached with the pressure of things unsaid, the growing awareness of what this evening was becoming. He had not invited Theo to stay late, but he hadn't asked him to leave either. Outside, the rain began to slow. The hour grew late, yet neither of them moved. The teacups sat empty. The studio, for all its stillness, felt more alive than it had in months. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a misted silence that clung to the windows like a forgotten breath. Outside, the world was still damp and drowsy, hidden in layers of fog and shadow. Inside the studio, time seemed to move differently. The clock ticked in the background, but its rhythm felt distant, like a sound heard underwater. Julian remained seated in the low armchair, his sketchbook still open on the table, pages fluttering slightly as the heater clicked and hummed. Theo sat across from him, knees drawn up, one hand resting under his chin. Neither of them spoke for some time. There was no need. The quiet was no longer a barrier. It was a space they occupied together. Julian's eyes wandered. He wasn't studying Theo now, not with the intent of capturing him on paper. This gaze was more personal, slower, less defined by lines and technique. He noticed things that had nothing to do with symmetry or form. The small scar near Theo's temple, the way his eyelashes caught the lamplight, the gentle slope of his shoulder where the robe had slipped unnoticed or maybe simply unbothered. There had always been something soothing about Theo's presence, not just the way he carried himself, but the weight of him in a room, a calm that settled things. Julian had grown used to it, depended on it even. But tonight, that calmness had taken on a different texture, one that made his chest tighten and his hands restless. The paintings on the wall watched silently. Dozens of versions of Theo looked back at them, some in oil, some in pencil, all quietly documenting something Julian hadn't fully understood when he first painted them. He realized now that each portrait had captured a different moment of not just Theo, but of himself, a map of evolving awareness. Theo spoke softly, his voice low and careful. He mentioned how strange it felt to see himself so many times on canvas, like stepping outside his own skin. Julian offered a slight nod, acknowledging the vulnerability of that truth. He didn't know what to say in return. Words still felt like the wrong tool for what lived between them. Instead, he stood and moved toward the far corner of the room. There, propped against a stack of unfinished canvases, was one he had kept hidden. He hesitated only a second before retrieving it. It wasn't complete. In truth, he had avoided working on it for weeks. The lines were rough, the shading tentative, but the feeling within it was raw, unfiltered. He handed it to Theo without speaking. Theo studied the piece quietly. It wasn't a traditional portrait. There were no sharp details, no clear composition, just the suggestion of a figure sitting alone, surrounded by muted colors, shadows bleeding into shadows. It was intimate in a way that the others were not. Not about posing, but about existing. Theo's fingers touched the edge of the canvas. He didn't comment, didn't analyze. He simply looked at it for a long time. Julian watched his reaction carefully, as if waiting for some confirmation he couldn't define. But Theo gave none. Only silence, softened by the weight of something shared. Julian turned back to the studio window, staring out into the night. The city lights had blurred into fog. He thought about all the evenings had spent here alone, the hours filled with color and silence, never expecting anyone to interrupt the pattern. And now, this man, this model, this presence, had taken root in places Julian didn't know had been empty. He spoke without looking back, words fragile and measured. He said that sometimes the most honest pieces were the ones he couldn't finish, that they resisted closure because the feeling behind them was still unfolding. The painting in Theo's hands was one of them. Theo didn't reply. Instead, he gently placed the canvas on the easel, as though returning it to the space where it belonged. The gesture said more than words could have. The air grew heavier, though not unpleasant, like a room holding its breath. Julian crossed the floor slowly and stood beside Theo. They didn't touch. Their shoulders were inches apart, but the proximity pulsed like a heartbeat. The studio had become a cathedral of unsaid things, of restraint and gravity and something like longing. In that moment, Julian realized he wasn't afraid of what he felt. He was afraid of what might never be said. Theo turned slightly toward him, his expression unreadable but open. Julian could feel the warmth of his skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The distance between them had never felt so thin, so easily crossed. But no one moved. There was no dramatic gesture, no impulsive leap into confession or contact. Just two men standing in a quiet room, surrounded by echoes of their shared time, the lines between artist and subject quietly dissolving. And as midnight passed and the world outside shifted into a deeper stillness, Julian understood. Some moments remain unfinished not because they are incomplete, but because they are still becoming. The clock on the far wall ticked onward, its hands edging closer to the deep hours of the night when the world softened and secrets pressed more easily to the surface. Outside, the fog held steady, wrapping the city in quiet, while inside the studio the air grew warmer, thicker, saturated with things that neither Julian or Theo had yet dared to voice. They had moved closer without deciding to. The room had grown smaller somehow, or perhaps their sense of space had shifted. There were no more canvases between them, no tea mugs to fidget with. Just the two of them standing by the wide studio window, bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp and the pale hue of distant streetlights breaking through the mist. Julian could feel his breath shortening, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. It had been building steadily, moment by moment, like water rising behind a fragile dam. He could feel Theo beside him, his presence unmistakable. There was no need to look. The proximity spoke for itself. Their arms nearly touched, but not quite. Their silence now felt deliberate, like a language they had agreed upon without words. Theo shifted slightly, just enough that Julian could sense the movement through the air. Not a step away, not a step closer. A pause, an invitation, a question without shape. Julian closed his eyes for a brief second, trying to slow the rhythm inside him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or clarity that filled his chest. He wasn't even sure it mattered anymore. What he knew, what had become unmistakable, was that this wasn't a passing moment. It was the edge of something. For weeks, he had studied Theo's face through the eyes of an artist. He had captured lines, shadows, expressions. But only now, standing this close, did he realize how much he hadn't allowed himself to feel. How often he had used his work to distance himself from what that feeling truly was. He opened his eyes. Theo was looking at him, not with expectation and not with confusion, just looking, with the quiet patience of someone who had chosen to stay long after he should have gone, with an openness that felt disarming in its simplicity. Julian exhaled. Neither of them moved. The space between them had become something sacred, fragile. Any gesture too strong might break it. Any word too direct might unravel it. So they remained there, in a balance so delicate that even breath felt like a choice. Theo turned his gaze back to the window, then let it drift across the studio walls, the ones lined with his own image. But his expression held no discomfort. There was an almost nostalgic sadness in it, as if he already sensed the ending of something that hadn't begun. Julian stepped slightly to the side, not away, just enough to lean his shoulder gently against the cool glass of the window pane. The night outside stared back at him, a foggy reflection of himself and Theo, two blurred figures suspended in soft light. He thought of all the moments leading here, the first sketch, the laughter on the second day, the silence of shared mornings when Theo would arrive early and sit in quiet while Julian mixed paint. None of it had been planned. None of it felt accidental. Theo spoke then, his voice quieter than before, barely more than a breath. He didn't say anything romantic or profound. He said something about the view, the way the fog softened the buildings, the way the light from the street lamp looked almost like moonlight. Julian nodded, his throat tight. He replied softly, agreeing. Not with the words, but with what sat behind them. The moment hovered, longer than it should have, longer than either of them likely expected. It wasn't tension anymore. It was stillness, the kind that settles in when two people reach the edge of what they can pretend not to know. Julian wanted to reach for Theo, not to pull him close, not even to touch, just to acknowledge the weight of what was present between them. But instead, he stayed still, allowing that space to exist unbroken. Theo finally turned toward him fully. His posture remained calm, but his eyes carried something deeper, a vulnerability that felt both raw and deeply human. Julian met that gaze with his own, his thoughts swirling but his body rooted in place. Whatever this was, it could not be undone. Not by words, nor by action. Not anymore. And then, just as easily as it had begun, the moment passed. Theo stepped away, not far, only a few feet, but enough to return them to safer ground. He walked toward the corner where his bag rested, lifting it slowly, not with haste but with quiet finality. Julian didn't stop him. He couldn't. The spell had lifted, and with it, the possibility of more, for now, had faded into the walls of the studio. But something lingered, a soft imprint, a change. Theo paused by the door. He didn't speak, and Julian didn't ask him to. Their eyes met once more, one last thread of unspoken understanding. Then Theo turned the handle and stepped out into the night, the door closing with a gentle click behind him. Julian stood there for a long while after, staring at the place where Theo had just been. The room now felt different. Not empty, but altered, as if something vital had been set into motion. Whatever had begun tonight, it was not finished. Morning arrived quietly. The city, still wet from the night before, glistened under a layer of soft early light. Julian stood alone in the studio, his hands resting on the windowsill, eyes tracing the pale blue horizon. The fog had begun to lift, revealing rooftops, chimneys, and narrow alleys that seemed somehow more honest under daylight. The world felt real again, and yet unreal too, changed like something essential had shifted while he wasn't looking. The studio carried the faint trace of last night. The mugs remained on the table, untouched since tea had gone cold. The sketchbook lay open, still showing the portrait of Theo that captured a rare smile, honest and fleeting. The chair where he had sat for hours remained slightly angled, as if it still remembered the shape of his body. Julian hadn't slept. After Theo left, the silence had returned, but it was no longer the silence of solitude. It was fuller now, layered with presence, heavy with memory. He had drifted between thoughts and unfinished sketches, unable to focus on anything for more than a few moments. Everything in the studio had come to feel like a symbol. The worn brushes, the half-squeezed tubes of paint, the faint warmth on the cushion of the chair. He didn't know what Theo was thinking. He didn't know if Theo would return. The goodbye hadn't been final, but it had carried the weight of restraint, of fear, of something held back. Still, something inside Julian had changed. He walked slowly to the easel in the center of the room. The unfinished portrait Theo had once placed there the night before still waited. Julian studied it, eyes following the delicate lines, the soft rendering of light and shadow that had never fully resolved into detail. It was more emotion than likeness, more truth than finish. He didn't touch it. Instead, he picked up a fresh canvas and set it beside the first. For a while, he stood motionless. Then, with a calm breath, he selected a brush, dipped it in muted blue, and began. The lines were soft at first, slow, exploratory, less about form and more about feeling. He wasn't recreating Theo. He was painting the moment, the stillness, the night that hadn't asked for answers, only honesty. As the morning unfolded, he painted in silence, the light from the tall windows shifting gradually across the floor. Birds moved past the glass in short, sudden arcs, like notes in the background of a quiet song. There was no plan, no layout, just the instinct to continue. And then, faintly, the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Julian froze. The brush hovered midair. His breath caught, not in fear, but in hope so sudden it startled him. The studio door remained closed. He waited. Then a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just a single knock, followed by stillness. Julian approached slowly, his heart hammering like a second pulse in his ears. He opened the door. Theo stood there, framed in morning light. His jacket slightly damp from the mist, hair tousled, eyes searching. Neither of them spoke. Julian stepped aside, and Theo entered. There was no ceremony, no explanation, just quiet understanding. He placed his bag on the floor, then looked around the studio as if seeing it all over again. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. Julian returned to the easel, unsure whether to speak, unsure what to say even if he did. But Theo stepped closer and looked at the fresh canvas, at the early brushstrokes, vague and uncertain but already alive. Julian could feel Theo's presence behind him, familiar now, no longer hesitant. Theo reached out slowly, placing his hand on the back of the nearby chair. The same chair he'd posed in so many times before. He didn't sit this time. Instead, his voice broke the silence, quiet, measured but certain. He said he had been thinking, that the space between them last night had said more than any words ever could, that sometimes the hardest things to say weren't confessions, they were invitations. Julian turned to him, eyes tired but clear, and he understood. They didn't talk about what came next. Not that day, not in that hour. They didn't talk about boundaries or consequences or what the world outside might think. They didn't define anything. Instead, Julian gestured toward the second chair, the one he had often used while sketching. Theo sat down slowly, his hands resting quietly in his lap. Julian returned to the canvas. For a long time, there was only the sound of the brush moving over linen, of breath and presence and light stretching slowly across the room. And in that moment, nothing needed to be said, because they had stayed, because neither had looked away, because some connections didn't need labels. Only time and space and the courage to remain.